wonderful Lachlan Kalache. And today we're also joined by the super wonderful Kim Bailey, who is a lecturer in law for the Centre for Law and Justice. So we have a bit of a superstar team with us, I think, today. So thank you for coming along and spending some time with us. And I think that over the past few weeks, we've been really looking at the online environment using Zoom, how to engage our audiences. And today we delve right into the crux of how we might provide our students with feedback, how we can provide some scaffolding around that feedback and what that might look like. So again, we've got quite a lot to go through, but this should be quite a timely session for most of you. If you haven't already had students doing assessments in your classes, that will probably be coming up very shortly. So I think this will be a very useful and very timely session today. So we'll go through a bit around types of feedback. We'll look at how we can create some of that feedback, what the structure might look like, how we might be going about providing the information to our students. We'll also get a chance to have a look at some exemplars and case studies. So we'll have a window into how other people do things, particularly how Kim Bailey does some wonderful things in some of her subjects. We'll also have a think about how we can make feedback consistent, which is quite important from a student perspective, as well as from a university's perspective, and how we can also support our students through the feedback process. So we'll look at some top tips around that area as well. So quite a lot to get through today, but hopefully you'll find some top tips that you can take away with you and use in your subjects. So I guess the first thing is a bit of an intro to feedback. We've all had feedback. Sometimes we get good feedback, sometimes we get bad feedback, and sometimes we get feedback that makes us think, pardon, what was that? What do I need to do? So I think we've had some feedback all at some point and not really known what to do about it. And maybe you've even had some feedback that makes you angry, frustrated, or confused. So I think we can all think of some of that feedback, and it's really good to sort of tell the story to your students around that, yes, we still get feedback as academics and as lecturers, and that still impacts us just as the same as it can impact students as well. So we know that feedback is a central aspect of the assessment process, and we also know it can have a significant impact on how students develop their learning. So feedback only really works if we engage with it and if we encourage our students to engage with it, to do something with it, to read it, to take it on board and to do something with that feedback. Have I missed anything there, Lachlan? Any of your initial thoughts on feedback?
No, not really. I think that what we'll probably find over the course of today, every time we run this session, we have the same kind of broad, very, very broad parameters, which is that whilst we might offer some commentary on our own experiences in the space, it's not exhaustive. And that what we're really most interested in is also hearing about other people's experiences and the audience's own feedback on feedback, so to speak. But we are approaching it from both sides of the equation, looking at both scaffolding and feedback today. So personally, I've always been more invested in the scaffolding side than the feedback, which is great because I've got other people here that will talk about the feedback side of things even more. So with that in mind, but by all means, continue on, please.
Thanks, Lachlan. So when it comes to feedback, I think most of us will have provided feedback at some point to our students, and we tend to look at it from sort of two broad categories of looking at formative feedback and summative feedback as well. So formative is probably what most people have in mind when we think about feedback at university. It's constructive and it's used to improve student learning and also our teaching. So it occurs during learning the whole idea is that students can act on it. It's not necessarily punitive. It's there to advance students' understandings through perhaps making mistakes or errors and then learning to correct or to avoid them in future attempts at assessments. The other type of feedback we have is more summative. And so this is the final judgment on a student achievement. So this is usually in the form of an end of session exam or an essay or a report or some other type of assessment. So it's a judgment, and it's also used to check learning at the end of a teaching episode, or for us, a session of study. We might find, though, that most pieces of assessment that students undertake at university have elements of both types of feedback. So we might provide comments and feedback alongside a final mark. So we use them in both instances. When we go about creating our feedback as well, and most of us will be quite used to the marking period where we get into the sort of the marking zone of what we're doing, but when we really sort of tease it apart, there's different types of feedback that we'll be providing along the way. So there's also the informal feedback that we can give students. This can occur at any time. It usually emerges as quite spontaneously in the moment or during action. So there's the informal side. We've got the formal feedback. It's planned, it's scheduled, there's a process behind it. Usually it includes some sort of achievement, some sort of standard, and it's also usually recorded for students and institutions. We've also got elements of traditional feedback. So this might be face-to-face discussions in class. It could be the written comments that we provide students. So it might be track changes, might be markups on a PDF. It can be annotations. It might be an attached document. So we'll look at that traditional mode of feedback a little bit today, but we'll also look at multimodal feedback today. So it might be that some of you have started using perhaps audio feedback, video feedback, and screencasts are also a possibility. Other types of feedback sit around that automatic type of feedback. So if we're using Test Center in Interact 2, so it might be multiple choice questions or short answer, some sort of interactives that you might have built into your subject site, they can have automatic feedback to students, which can be quite empowering for students as they're working their way through the subject. We also need to have a bit of a think about the audience for our feedback. So sometimes we'll be giving individual feedback, sometimes it's group feedback, or other times it's class or subject level feedback across different cohorts and groups. So there's lots of different elements to how we can give feedback and what that might look like. So we thought we'd get your feedback to begin with on how you go about perhaps even strategies you have behind scaffolding in your subject. So Lachlan's put the link there to a quick Menti to get us started this morning. Having a quick question around how you provide appropriate levels of scaffolding around your assessments. So we get our students in the run up to creating their assessments and submitting their assessments, and then we can provide some more feedback. So how do you provide the appropriate level of scaffolding around your assessment? We've got some drop-down options there in the box. Thank you, Lachlan, for you to choose. So jump in there, have a go. And again, this will look different to everybody, won't it, Lachlan, depending on what subject you're teaching, the discipline area, what level of cohort you're teaching.
And it's not exhaustive as well. I mean, this was basically thrown together with some ideas around how some people think about scaffolding leading into assessment submission, but it's not an exhaustive list. I suppose the trick in this one is that it's a ranking activity. So it really is asking you to think about priorities a little bit from your point of view. So from the 7 that are there, you'll need to try and rank them. However, there aren't right and wrong answers in this space. This is really just testing the waters to get an idea about your take on things. So let's have a look at what they look like coming through. There you go. Isn't that interesting? First and foremost, making sure that the subject outline contains both a clear description and rubric. That does seem pretty sensible to me. Assessment focused Zoom workshops. Okay, what's down the bottom of the list? Making sure that all the assessment items are all in the one folder. That's interesting. We've got 10 responders. We'll have 10 seconds, I guess, more, and then we'll kick into the next part. Again, we're just testing the waters a little bit. If you feel that there was something glaringly obvious missing from this list that you really feel should have been in there so that you could put it above everything else, by all means, share away. Shove it in the chat pod with us so we can talk about it. Assessment templates. Absolutely. Exemplars, templates. Certainly, obviously, task dependent, whether or not it has a text type that a template's going to work for, but absolutely, Shara. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your responses in this space. That's really interesting. So that was the scaffolding space. The other side of the equation that Prue started to talk about this morning was looking at feedback types, appropriate feedback. This one is a little more open. So what I'm going to do is I will grab that one and I will open this one. No, I'm not. I'll drop it into the chat pod. There we go. That's for voting. This time round, it's actually open response, trying to gauge some of your own strategies for providing adequate and appropriate feedback, which will bring up this voting portal. How do you ensure adequate and appropriate levels of feedback for your assessment items? Again, we're just interested in collecting your initial thoughts in this space. Don't have to use all 250 characters. Don't feel obliged. But we will have a look at some of those responses as they come in. Yeah, Peter's made a comment in the chat pod about making sure that you discuss in class, assuming face-to-face or in online meetings, the expectations. I think that's absolutely critical. If time isn't taken, even in an informal setting, to be able to break down and discuss task requirements and unpack any uncertainties, misunderstandings, and probably provide more than one opportunity to do that, you're missing an opportunity. So I'm inclined to agree with you absolutely. So how do we do appropriate levels of feedback, adequate levels of feedback, different modes, reciprocal modes of feedback, providing exemplars. This is about your own approach to giving feedback to others. How do you approach that? That's the question. Targeted comments throughout the assessment, solutions provided, audio feedback, in-text comments, audio feedback. It's a bit of a recurring theme so far there, which is good to see. Okay, highlighting parts of the rubric. We've got an example that looks at that. Comments throughout the documents, using a comment bank in Norfolk. Same thing for those using Cadmus Turnitin, for example, and the quick marks tool, for example. Norfolk reference there again. That's great, everyone. Thank you very much for engaging with that so quickly and readily and sharing some of your ideas in that space. I think with that in mind, Prue, we will keep on keeping on, which brings us to the lovely Kim Bailey. It was almost Sailor of the Century-esque there. That was Joe Bailey. Close, though. Thanks, Kim.
Well, good morning. Lachlan and Prue have asked me to just, I guess, give you a bit of a walk through some of the subject sites where I've been trialling some of these assessment feedback forms. So I might share my screen with you. We're going to have a look at Padlet for assessment scaffolding, and we're also going to have a look at assessment folders and so forth. And Lachlan, in that list, if I've missed anything, please remind me.
No
okay,
problem.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen now. In relation to, I hope what you can see is Law 217, Civil Procedure, is that right?
I can't see the subject code, but yes, it is.
Yes, excellent. Okay, good. So in this subject, I inherited this subject this year and taught it in the first session. And it does tap into my professional background, but when I inherited the subject, it had very high fail rates and very low progress rates and quite a number of disgruntled students. So I set about overhauling the assessment regime, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically it had a 50% essay task that was basically the assessment together with a 50% examination. And students found that that just wasn't scaffolding their learning enough and weren't particularly happy. So what we did was that we actually broke it down into a narrative in this subject where the assessment mirrored every topic that we were learning about each week. And there were rolling assessments, as you can see down here. So quite a lot of assessments, that's true, but they were short, bite-sized chunks. Each assessment lives in its own assessment folder. So the students could find all of the information pertaining to that particular assessment in that folder. Now, the text type for the assessments did not change. They were all file notes, which is a professional artifact that students need to learn to do. So short, succinct, clear analysis of an issue. But what did change was the factual scenario. And we had a case essentially that was evolving in court that the students had to deal with and respond to as issues came up, and we invented new factual scenarios. So in the assessment folder, we embedded, and this was Lachlan's idea, and I'm very grateful, we embedded some Padlet walls that were specific to each assessment folder and each assessment task. The first assessment task they found really difficult because it was a new text type for them. It required them to bring together a lot of information in a very succinct manner, and it was actually a really difficult topic. So the amount of scaffolding I needed to do before the assessment was quite extensive. And what I didn't account for was how many questions that they might have had that they weren't feeling comfortable to necessarily ask on the discussion board or via email to me, but they were really happy to post on a Padlet wall. The good thing about the Padlet wall as well was that you can respond instantaneously, and it seems to be a format that students feel quite comfortable. I guess we often assume they're digital natives. Not all of them necessarily are, but certainly this form of medium they find a lot easier to correspond in. But the nice part about it was too, I noticed in the assessment folders as we went along, they started dialoguing with each other on these Padlet walls and providing each other with assessment information and details as well, which I could moderate and weigh in on to correct if it was incorrect or encourage and add to. What I could also do with this Padlet wall was to point them to websites that were helpful to them in relation to finding the civil procedure rules that they needed. I could also then collate frequently asked questions and drop in a short podcast, which I recorded on Anchor FM, into the Padlet wall. What I did was I collated the traffic I was getting in emails and the discussion board that students may or may not be aware of, and collated all for this assessment in one central place so the student could listen to it. And they could essentially then listen to that frequently asked questions in relation to that assessment task. So that worked really well. And I noticed the traffic on the Padlet wall decreased as the assessments went on, mainly because I think they understood then what was required of them. The other thing that was really beneficial was that they really wanted to know, apart from getting their papers returned to them with the usual commented feedback, a rubric and a global mark, they wanted to know how they were going in terms of the cohort. I don't know if this is particularly law students who are incredibly competitive with each other, or it's possibly in your subjects also. So what I did was I provided them with a feedback feed forward video, particularly for assessment 1, to tell them what they had done as a cohort that was done well, what they needed to think about in terms of their next file note task and their next assessment, and just a few areas of law that they really needed to drill down on that I found they hadn't actually understood well enough, that was actually foundational for setting them up in their analysis of the next problem. I'm not sure if I'm actually sharing my sound, but nonetheless, can you hear that? No, not
at the moment.
That's okay. So essentially what I'd go through is I would actually give them in a depersonalized way, the highest grade, the lowest grade, the median. I'd explain to them the things they did well, the things they need to work on, and so forth. That was a very short 15-minute video, but or 5-minute video, I think. They found that really helpful as well. So yeah, the assessment folders I'd really encourage. I think they're really helpful to use in any subject, so that even things such as Turnitin details, if you require an assessment cover sheet to be put on the assessment task, just different information. And it was really lovely because it actually built that peer-to-peer learning as well between students. I noticed in this subject, we went from 41% peer-to-peer learning up to 87% in one session. So, and I do attribute a lot of that to the Padlet walls and to the sharing of ideas on assessment. Not only that, but also to online study groups. Okay, so that was one aspect that I could show you. Lachlan, where to now? Where would you like to go next?
I think I'm interested in I guess talking about the different approaches you took prior to the assessments being due. So you sort of made yourself available in a number of ways to the students I'm aware of. Do you want to talk about some of those? Yes.
So the other thing that we do in all of our law subjects frequently is just-in-time drop-in sessions. And the reason for that is that the 1-hour tutorial we have with the students is never long enough to actually deal with all of their assessment questions and to walk them through the assessment. So frequently what we'll do is, obviously they've got the rubric and the subject outline description of the task. They've got the assessment folder with additional information. They'll be given a template or an exemplar that's in relation to an entirely different situation. But we'll have an assessment drop-in session as well, which is at least 2 weeks before the assessment task is due, and where I'm available for 1 hour, usually during lunchtime, where they can literally drop in or drop out as they like to ask any questions that they have about the assessment task. It's very helpful because you'll find that students will, particularly working students, which is the bulk of our cohort, will actually find that time to drop in for 5 minutes and ask their particular question and then leave. I do record the sessions as well for those who are not able to attend. But equally, it's great feedback for me in terms of what I might not have taught clearly or what they may not have understood, so that I can then group that information together in a frequently asked questions podcast and pop that into the Padlet wall on the assessment folder. So assessment drop-in sessions can be really helpful for students, particularly if you're a little time poor in relation to your teaching and your tutorials. In the subject that I've just shown you, civil procedure, because our assessment was so intimately connected in the narrative of the unfolding of the subject, half of our tutorials each week actually were dealing with assessment very explicitly. So we would be teaching a particular concept or a topic that week. And for half of the tutorial, we would then say, okay, well, looking at our scenario here, which was our case that we created, a mock piece of litigation, how do the principles we've learned today inform what's coming up in this assessment task? And we'd then have breakout groups and dialoguing about that. And it was a really valuable thing to do, to have that constant narrative and to be working towards assessment each week. It actually increased the attendance dramatically at the tutorials, the live tutorials, albeit that we have a lot of people that watch the recordings. I found the engagement throughout the course of the subject much higher because they knew every week I was explicitly going to be dealing with the next assessment that was on the horizon. And we would be talking about that and dialoguing about that in our tutorials.
Kim, just to clarify on that, how did the students know? At what point did you tell them first up that their online meetings were going to be structured in that way?
Yeah, right from the get-go. So this was, it wasn't something I'd communicated in the subject outline because I guess I considered it more a teaching strategy, but I did communicate that very clearly to them on the weekly announcements and also on discussion boards and also in relation to what was contained in the assessment folders. So the message to students was in this subject, there's a lot of material to cover. You have got 5 assessment tasks, which are all bite-sized chunks as we work through this material, but we're going to be working on that assessment together every week in your tutorial. So we were very explicit about the assessment, which was a little bit different for me because normally what we do is we teach content and then say, now go away and I'm going to assess you on that content. Here we actually grappled with the assessment together and worked through how we would do that and why the principles we were learning every week applied to that particular assessment that was coming up on the horizon. So it worked really well for students and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive.
Just devil's advocate here for a minute, if I may. Did you ever have any, I guess, feedback from either within the meetings themselves or outside of that, that the students thought that the online meeting time should have been used for something else rather than the assessment?
Yeah, absolutely not. I think most students really have the attitude of, I need to know what I have to do to get through this subject. Hopefully they'll enjoy the learning journey as well. That's what we want to achieve as teachers. But at the end of the day, most students are very time poor and they actually want to know what they have to do to perform well in assessment. That's really why they're there. That's what they're directing their learning towards. So rather than sort of being subtle about that, I was really explicit about that. If you want to succeed in this subject, you're going to do 4 file notes and then you're going to do an application to the court, which is an oral assessment. And that's how you're going to get through this subject with an examination at the end. I thought that the number of assessment tasks that we had would be a little too many, but actually the students were really positive about it because they found that that constant unfolding narrative and the explicit instruction and support in tutorials each week was exactly what they wanted. They could make meaning out of what is actually very boring procedural rules unless you've got something to hang it on.
Right. I think it might be a good opportunity here, I suppose. We've got quite a few people in the room, obviously, that have had their own sort of experiences in this space. Does anyone have any questions for Kim about what she's raised so far and the different strategies that she's had for scaffolding prior to submission? Anyone at all? not excluding you from that list as well, Prue, if you've got anything you'd like to chime in on. But yeah, if not, I'm more than happy to hear more from Kim about the actual feedback from students.
I might just jump in with one question, and again, I'm trying to think of a way to word this without it sounding negative, but I guess, Kim, it looks like, we know you're a really engaged teacher and you're really great at what you do. And I'm wondering if in the lead up to this process of building out your subject site and also building into the content, the ability to provide feedback and scaffolding, was it a lot of work for you, or do you think that has that sort of paid off in the outcome from students? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Prue. So look, it was a lot of work to overhaul the assessment regime from what it was, which was a really simple essay question, through to a rolling progressive scenario. And in terms of academic integrity, I obviously have to change that factual scenario for next year because, we know papers get sold, supplied, and so forth. That's not a problem. Recreating a scenario each year isn't an issue, but I know that I'll be teaching, 4 file notes next year that deal with particular topics that are already set. So once I've done the initial work, it's not that difficult to vary the narrative that supports the work behind it. Yes, it was a lot of work initially to set it up, but it was actually quicker to mark because they were very small assessments. And once we'd done that very comprehensive feedback in the first assessment, we found as markers we didn't need to give quite as much feedback in the subsequent assessments, as well as to text type, referencing, the basic things that were required in the particular type of assignment. So there were savings along the way of getting a student to almost repeat a form of assessment, albeit different content, as we went along. So I think, in terms of the retention, the failure rate went from, I think it was 25% down to 11%. The student satisfaction was significantly greater. And I had a number of students who'd failed the subject in the previous year, and they were so vocal about, this is totally different to what we've done before. Now I get it. And as a teacher, I found that really encouraging. So that was enough to make me want to do the work on the assessment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one too, isn't it? That the feedback we get from students can be such a motivator, negative or positive from students. It can be such a motivator for us to then look at our practice and think about what we can change or what we might do better, or even if we don't know what to do, what we could trial next time. And I think you're a really good example of trialing different things to get the feedback. And it is high risk. I saw Lachlan put that into the chat box, that some of these elements are risky as an academic to do, but we do need to try and keep innovating in what we do and how we do it to see what works and what doesn't for our cohort. And each of our cohorts is quite different again, and based on the topic that we're teaching or discipline or even the assignment type. So it is difficult, but I think you're a really great example of it is worth a try. It's worth trialing something. So thanks, Kim.
Point of order, Your Honour. I was raising the fact that having 2 assessments at 50% each was high risk.
Sorry, Lachlan,
rather than Kim's approach, but yeah.
It was high risk. I mean, I think that's exactly right. If you overhaul an assessment regime and if your colleagues haven't done that before, it is risky. And I did learn things from this. It wasn't perfect. So from a marker's point of view, there was a lot of assignments to mark, even though the commenting reduced as we went along. So I'd probably drop one of those file notes along the way. But the oral assessment at the end was a real winner. The students loved that. And that was very quick to mark. And I actually marked that with Norfolk as well. So you calibrate as you go along.
I like it. It's nice to see the evolution process in play. So thanks, Kim.
The other feedback I can...
in there. Sorry,
yep.
Kim, we've got a comment from Peter just about that point about assessments having fewer with higher percentages, etc. There's 2 sides to that coin, obviously. Some people are quite comfortable with having a reduced number of assessments, because if you, I suppose, look at it glass half full, the students might do fine in the first one and feel pretty comfortable and relaxed about passing the subject because they've already achieved a significant block. But the other half, particularly for students that are having difficulty, is that if they fail the first assessment task or only just pass it, etc., it's immediately placing a significant pressure on the second task as well. And sometimes educational designers will talk about diffusing the risk across a number of assessments. So they might have low stakes initially and then gradually increase percentages, rather than having I suppose, a more simplistic, two assessment task structure. But I know that there's also faculty approaches, preferences around numbers of assessment as well, and that there's marking, workload implications, and all sorts of other things to consider. So anyway, there's other things that influence that. Sorry, Kim.
Yeah, I think on that point, you've got to remember too that you've got no real prospect of giving feed forward if you're going to weight something 50%, because chances are the text type or the type of assignment is going to change. It's usually an exam and an essay or something like that. So that's really not helpful, the feedback you're going to give them. They just know why they didn't perform well and they have no opportunity to improve. And secondly, it's a recipe for low engagement in your subject and your tutorials each week, because why would I bother? I'm just going to focus on my 50% assignment rather than turning up to your tutorials. So I think it kind of has to go hand in hand with the teaching plan and the assessment. And it was a real lights on for me in terms of explicitly teaching towards assessment, because we often don't do that. And it was great to also say to students, because we have online study groups, now I haven't got enough time to go through all of this tonight, but this would be a really good thing for you to talk about together in your study group. And what would be okay in your study group is to discuss X, Y, and Z. And so we were able to be quite explicit with them in this assessment regime as well about what was academic integrity and what was not academic integrity in terms of collusion in study groups. So that was an interesting part of doing it this way as well.
Now, Kim, you've mentioned the magic word there, study groups. Could you unpack what that involves for the folks here? They might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, sure, no problems. I'll just share my screen and I can show you probably easier than I can talk through. So again, subject site. So in law, we have found a happy problem in that we have increasingly large cohorts. We are a 3-year online program, purely online, with residential schools that are optional for subjects beyond the first year. 150 students in an online context can sometimes be very difficult as to working out how best to leverage their connectedness and their learning, and also to leverage that peer-to-peer learning. And that has always been a bit of a bugbear for me in SES results. And from what I understand, it is for many academics. So we came up with this idea of online study groups, a way of actually connecting students with each other to learn from each other, specifically because there's a large amount of content, but also to scaffold towards assessment. And it was really surprising how it works. So it's provisioned and set up in Blackboard. It's a self-assigned opt-in system. It is not accessible whether or not you participate. There will always be solitary learners who don't want a bar of it, and that's absolutely fine. But for those who do, and we're generally finding we're getting about 60 to 70% uptake across all of the law degree. And interestingly, they jump in these in first year, and they actually asked us to roll them out in all of our law subjects, not just the subjects that I had them in. So the students who do participate really like them. You opt into a study group, and we've given them a bit of scaffolding here about how you might like to actually run your study group, some Zoom cheat sheet and some information on how they can use CSU's Zoom account. Although what we do find is they tend to meet outside of the learning management system and outside of Zoom. They tend to meet on WhatsApp or other ways. So they opt into a group. It's provisioned in the subject site, and they have their own file exchange. They have their own group discussion board where they can exchange details and ideas, where they can post different things that might be helpful to each other. What we often find is that they will start using the discussion board or file exchange early on, and then they disappear. They tend to go offline, but they are nonetheless very active, and it's been really successful. So in the discussion, in the study groups, I always make it very explicit to them that I'm available. At any point in time, I'm happy to drop into your study group. If you're working on study notes together, be it a Google document or whatever it is, I'm happy to review that or respond to that. And frequently they'll invite you in to the study group because they mightn't have understood something particularly. What's really surprising about these groups is that it's given them 3 things. Firstly, it's given them a voice that they're happy to use and that they wouldn't have been happy to use as an individual learner. So the way they look at it is that if 8 of us are finding this a difficult concept, then it's worth approaching the lecturer, and we're happy to do that collectively, as against 8 separate students struggling on their own trying to nut it out. So that's been really important. Secondly, they work explicitly towards assessment. We give them quite explicit instructions on what is okay and what's not okay in this study group context in terms of working together. So for example, online quizzes, you don't do those together. That's collusion, and you're not to work together on those tasks. However, if we're working towards something different, then it's okay to discuss the question, debate the question, share information about different cases and legislation, but you must write your own work and not share your own written work with other members in your group. So it's increased academic integrity, I believe, as well, because they know much more what's expected of them, and we're being very explicit. But thirdly, it's really reduced social isolation of students, and it's leveraged our peer-to-peer learning statistics across the whole Centre for Law and Justice, which is really encouraging and exciting. We're finding that they are beavering away in these online study groups, and that they're feeling much more connected with each other. And as I said before, they'll form them in first year, and they're tending to track through together right through the degree and choosing their subjects together, because they've got a supportive environment where they can share resources, information, and encourage each other. So it's not that difficult to set up. In terms of monitoring it, I make it very clear that I'm not monitoring this space, that I'm happy to come into this space if I'm invited, but at the same time, if there's a problem in the group, so for example, disrespectful communication, behaviour that's exclusory, or whatever, then I will wade in and I will get involved. But generally speaking, this is student driven, and it's been really beneficial.
Yeah, look, I think I might make a couple of comments from my own observations in that space. The first one, I guess, is that was this message about the recommendation, not just within the one subject, but again, across the whole degree, that the experience, particularly of studying purely online, could be enhanced. It's not for everybody. You're going to get people that are absolutely individual pursuit style students that don't particularly want to be socializing, being involved with other people in their study, but actually there is a significant number that are not like that, but haven't, I guess, taken those first steps in trying to have a network, a peer learning network, etc., to assist them. So all this is, by and large, is the first steps and reinforcement from the academics in the subjects. It would be really good if you're struggling with this, or if you think you would, find value in sharing your experiences with others, etc., and tackling the learning together. This is a strategy and a way you can do it. Here's the location. All you need to do is click here and sign into one and then turn up. And then it's really, as Kim said, they're only in there for a brief period of time before they've established their own network separately in, the medium that they're comfortable with. And as I put in the chat there, we've seen them use WhatsApp a lot. They quite quickly grab onto that because they can just join it through their mobile phones. Obviously, they get the app, they join the WhatsApp group, etc. And then they've got their own kind of repository for storing and communicating, etc. So they've got a stream of communication happening over there. We're not invited into that space. It's their space, essentially, to help tackle the learning. And Facebook's the other one, of course, but predominantly I've seen WhatsApp feature again and again. They seem to share the WhatsApp number. And maybe the other thing, Kim, I guess is number, like in terms of an effective number of people in a study group. We're probably still learning in that space, do you think?
Yeah, no, we've learned a lot. I think 8 to 10 tops. Unfortunately, this year in one of my subjects, we set up one quite by accident for 15, and it's too large. And interestingly, I've had some students say to me, the group I'm in is too large. Can I opt out and join another group? Which is easily done. You can actually cancel their enrollment from one group, and then they're free to enroll into another group. So I think optimal is 8 to 10, provided they're working well together. Yeah. The way you set this up, I can see a question in the chat pod, is that it's, if you're not sure how to set up the group tools and to provision each of the groups yourself, then just simply log a job with an educational designer, giving them the number of groups that you want and the actual tools that you'd like to provision the study groups with. So such as the file exchange, discussion board, being able to email the members in their groups, really critical as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think don't overthink it. That's the key message. Just by creating the groups, having an item in your navigation bar on your subject site ready there. So, maybe you set 10 up there, put a cap in. Kim's saying 8. I said 5 to 7. It's in the same kind of ballpark. Basically, it's going to be discipline specific, but don't have it too high. Otherwise, you end up having, we've talked about having kind of, cliques within the actual groups themselves, the in crowd within a group and another. You don't want it to be that big that people are forming groups within the group, right? So small enough that they can still have their own network. Encourage them from the get-go to join one and sort out a time when they can meet. Kim's just provided broad guidelines about how they might want to apply using their study groups. And I think maybe we can share that, Kim, those suggestions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So in the subject site, again, I'll just share with you the information. So I think particularly for first years, or if it's not familiar to them, obviously now they're a lot more familiar in law with this concept than what they were, but being quite explicit to them about, well, here's what you could do each week. Here's a proposed method that ties in with my teaching plan of how you could leverage from your study group to help yourself succeed. And again, explicit instructions about assessment. So what I'll also do in the early weeks with study groups, particularly first year subjects, is that I will go into their study groups through Interact2, and I will actually do a group email to them as well, just motivating them along if I feel that they're not doing anything, because I generally have a look at their discussion board and see what they've been up to. But I'll send them an email saying, how are you going? Are you meeting? Do you need some help? Here's what I'd suggest as a proposed way of going about your meetings. So book a weekly time on Zoom together, or WhatsApp, or whatever platform you choose. Do our weekly problem question together using this methodology. Once you've done that, prepare a Google document and come back to the tutorial. The other thing we're using the study groups with, interestingly, is in first year, we've started creating a study checklist for our first year students, because we find that they just don't even begin to understand how to get their head across so much material and how they can read effectively. So we're actually giving them quite explicit instructions in that study checklist of, here's what you can do on your own, but here's what you could use your study group for as well to leverage in your weekly learning program. So we found it's been really successful and really encouraging. I think the loveliest story I heard out of these was retired police officer, somebody else at CSU, actually a staff member doing law, got together, pulled a young girl into their group. She was a single mum who had always wanted to study law, who was struggling to actually get her head around the material and feeling a complete lack of confidence and connection because she was at home caring also for a very disabled child. She said to me she was about to drop out of the whole course because she felt she just wasn't smart enough to do the course. But the other two got hold of her, brought her into a study group and worked with her on the side in that environment in a very encouraging and collaborative way. She passed with flying colours, and it was actually the deal breaker for her as to whether she stayed in the course or whether she actually cancelled her enrolment. So that's one example of how I think it can be a very powerful tool and work very well.
Kim, did you want to show one of those checklists just to sort of get people in the right frame of mind?
Yep, no problem.
And then we can hand back to Prue to continue on in the slides that we never follow.
Okay, so this is a first year subject. It's incredibly content heavy. It hits them like a freight train, this subject. It's the first one they do in what we call the Priestley 11 subjects in law. So we've basically created a weekly study checklist for them that is informed by a number of things. It's informed by obviously the learning outcomes in your subject outline, but it's also informed by what I'm working towards in assessment in terms of what's going to be in the examination at the end and what they need to be learning for the assessments along the way. So each week they get a list of key concepts, again, informed by the learning outcomes, but they get a to-do list as well. So the idea is that if you work through this to-do list, and whether it's self-paced yourself as a solo learner or whether it's together in a study group context, this will get you through this subject. This is what you need to do. Now, in that to-do list, I'm highlighting key aspects of their text that they need to read. I'm suggesting the podcasts that they need to listen to. I do concept podcasts, which are in the subject site. I'm telling them what also is in the subject site in terms of interactive activities. These subjects have been through TOL, and we have quite a number of interactive activities. Some of them are more valuable than others in terms of building towards assessment. So I'll be highlighting for them those activities that I think would be really helpful this week if you've got time to do them. And then tying in with the teaching strategy for the subject, where we have an online weekly tutorial with 2 problem scenarios that they have to work through and apply legal principles to. We're saying here, put aside the time to discuss these problems in your study group and start considering that in the context of assessment 2 that's coming up. So we're actually telling them, this is what would be good to use your study group for each week, or for this week, with the next assessment in mind. We also put down the bottom here what assessment this weekly preparation is working towards. So at the moment, they're working towards completing their first online quiz, low stakes pre-census assessment, but they also need to start thinking about their second assessment, because the topic material we're covering this week in these key concepts at the top is going to inform that assessment too. So it's being very explicit with the students, and it's also suggesting the different places they might like to go in terms of enhancing their learning if they're time poor. Now, some students will follow this to the letter. Other students will do everything, every activity in the subject site, every reading available, and that's okay. I guess what I'm communicating with this document is that, okay, if you're time poor, the bare minimum of what you need to do to enhance your learning for assessment this week is this. And I have been quite explicit too in saying to them, this is what I'm writing your exam from.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, it's interesting to note with the study guides, as you said, that they are done at a level that is meant to be explicit for students that are seeking obviously that level of detail and sequence, really to do with their weeks of learning each week. Exactly what should I be doing? Because we do build a lot of assumption into our subject sites, into the way our learning materials are put. Maybe it's deliberate, maybe it's not. Some people will include a lot of the elements that you probably saw in those checklists in your announcements each week. This week you need to look at this, 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 and this. And there's a huge level of scope in the detail and structure provided in people's announcements. I think in a subsequent PD session, we'll be looking at the announcement tool and how people approach that. But it's not that one has to replace the other or vice versa. It's that there's a certain segment of our students that want essentially an artifact, the idea that they can print out a list to keep next to them for their study, to mark things off. I've done that, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. They want basically an itinerary, which is the way that's come about. So for those of you trying that type of approach, or would like some more information about how it works, etc., do reach out to us, and we're happy to talk through that as well. So look, I guess thank you very much, Kim, for sharing all of those different strategies towards scaffolding, etc., with the assessments. It's been really, really helpful and informative. Prue, shall I share the slide deck again if you'd like to keep talking to some of those points?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lachlan. And thanks, Kim, because I think you give us some great examples of how you scaffold and provide feedback from yourself to students, but how you can also engage students in the process to support and scaffold each other. So I think it's a really nice way of having a look at how we can do sort of both of those elements and engage our students in that at the same time. So thank you. There's quite a lot now that's been written on providing feedback to students, and some of the material we have here today is coming from, I'm just looking it up now, a paper from 2014 by Naylor et al. And it's a really nice breakdown of some structure that's behind this. In fact, I might put the full reference in the chat, because I think if you're interested in this, I've just tried to paste it, but it didn't work. I will get it to you. But feedback is about being timely, and we know that. And I think we're really good at being timely with that, giving feedback while details are still fresh. And the feedback can actually assist students in a future task or in some sort of future performance. It's also about being clear, and I think Kim has really provided great examples of that, being as unambiguous as we possibly can. And so sometimes we need to put our beginner's hat back on and have a think about the language and the way we're explaining these different types of things and concepts to our students. So try not to assume that students have the same sort of understanding of academic language or of the academic discourse as we might have. Even phrases such as good work can be quite unclear, or I mean, have we all been at that point? I think where we've had assignments when we were studying with the red pen all the way through with ticks and crosses, but you're never quite clear what that actually related to. So just thinking about what the connection is for the student, how they'll understand the feedback we're giving. Trying to be as educative as we possibly can, not just evaluative in our comments. So indicating that something is incorrect, the big red cross, that's okay, but we also need to provide some suggestions for what you would prefer to see, or perhaps how a student might come to a different understanding of what it is that you were trying to teach them. So making sure that while we're correcting things, we can also be improving things. Even when there's a tick, when you think so student's done something very well, what was it that they did well? What do you think they should be continuing into the next assignment or the next assessment that you might have? Another good idea is thinking about being proportionate to the criteria and the goals. So perhaps more time should be spent providing the feedback on some of the more significant parts of the assessment task, and perhaps less time in correcting or perhaps correcting every single every single time a student put a semicolon instead of a colon, because I know that happens quite a lot. There's a bit of confusion there. So having a think about how you, I suppose, apportion your time to how you provide the feedback. So there's lots of things we can think about there. Thanks, Lachlan.
Right, I might just chime in for 1 second with something before it slips my mind, and that's that sometimes our approach to feedback particularly is also influenced by how easy it is functionally to do that. So within the tool set itself. So I know a lot of people are probably working along a fairly sort of consistent approach that we have, where we get students to submit documents. Maybe those documents go into EASE. We get a Word document on the other end. We mark it up. We send it back. Essentially, we're doing other things in Turnitin, things like that. And then ultimately, people are manually putting grades into the Grade Centre, which is not necessarily the most conducive approach for making it easy to provide integrated feedback alongside the student submission. So we talk about integration a lot. Educational designers will talk about that, and other sort of technical staff looking at the tool set. But I just would also highlight that we have other tools available at the uni, and that some people use particular tools here because of the affordance that it gives them in terms of feedback. So I'm going to show one example of that now before I give Prue back the reins, and that is from a communication subject. Obviously, with the degree being revamped, they might not have these subjects for that much longer, but we'll have a look at an example anyway. I just want to point out that I'm actually going to pause the recording for a moment before I do this, because there'll be student details in here and I don't want those captured on the recording. So allow me to pause.
And feedback at CSU. And sometimes it's about rethinking how we use them. And I think that's a really good example of just rethinking what we could do with that tool and what it might look like from a student and staff perspective. There's lots of bonuses. So just a few more points just around locating student performance in our feedback. And again, this goes back to really saying what they did right and what they did wrong, and then feeding that forward. So what do they do with that? Another good point is around emphasising task performance. So focusing on the task rather than perhaps the student or some attributes of the learner. So sometimes it's difficult to tease it apart, but it is important to keep going back to, well, what was the task asking of the student, and how has the student responded to that? I think most of us do quite a good job of that. Making sure we're phrased as an ongoing dialogue rather than just an endpoint. So reaching out to the students and letting them know that they can also come back to you with feedback and comments. So it's an invitation, it's the start of a discussion when it comes to our feedback. And also, I think a key one, particularly with everything that's going on around us at the moment, is just being sensitive to the individual. It should really reflect the individual students' sort of context and history. Most of us know our students quite well. Thinking about how we can really reach through, be sensitive to their needs, and really encourage that positive self-esteem and motivation from our students as well. So that one can take a little bit of practice as we go, but we all know how we like to be approached with feedback from our other people at the university. So really taking that with us as we provide feedback to our students as well. Oh, a little bit around feedback consistency. So making sure that we're doing the task, writing an answer guide for our markers. And I think Kim has some really good examples of this as well. So making sure that we're sharing our standards of what we'd expect from our students with other people who might be in our teaching team as well. Going through and perhaps modelling the marking for our teaching team, showing how we might mark a range of different types of papers and discussing this with our markers. Listening to what our students are telling us, you can poll them, be prepared to host some drop-ins. So great examples again from Kim about how we can use Zoom, and many of you are saying that you're doing that as well, to really have a really good discussion around breaking down what the assessment is asking from our students. Perhaps publishing an answer guide for our markers, giving some specific, some personal feedback, but also some cohort general feedback. So the different types of feedback for those different audiences that we spoke about at the beginning of this session. But feeding forward, so that's the key one. What did you do well? What do you need to focus on next time? So connecting it to professional skills and making it as relevant as possible. Lots of great top tips there.
Thank you, Prue. Again, we've managed to stray, across our slides in a deliberate way, is probably how I like to see it. Look, I'd like to, again, thank Kim Bailey for all of her input today and showing us all of her exemplary work. That's fantastic. And thank you all for coming along to another Tuesday PD session. We'll be here, I'm going to say all week, but no, we'll be here again on Thursday and see you next week. Thursday's one, we'll be looking at some tools to help with planning your teaching. I do recommend you come along for that one. We have a few surprises in store, but wishing you all a great teaching week ahead, and we'll catch you again. Thanks again.